The radar blip shouldn't have been there. Not at that altitude, not in that corridor, and definitely not moving at that speed with half its control surfaces missing. The tower controller at Kandahar Air Base stared at his screen, watching the ghost signature limp across the display like a wounded bird refusing to fall. The transponder code identified it as Hog 27, an A-10 Thunderbolt II that had been reported Winchester and RTB 40 minutes ago. But the flight path was all wrong. Instead of the straight line home, this aircraft was circling something in the mountains, losing altitude with each pass, painting the sky with its infrared signature like blood in water. The shift supervisor picked up the red phone, his hand steady despite the cold weight settling in his stomach. 3 hours earlier, a civilian jet had gone off radar in those same mountains. On board was Marcus Castellanos, the tech billionaire whose satellite network kept half the coalition's drones in the air. Now someone was orbiting the crash site in a plane that should have been landing, and the math didn't add up to anything good. Captain Nadia Kassan felt the A-10 shudder as another hydraulic line gave out, the yellow caution light joining the constellation of warnings already illuminating her cockpit. The Warthog's right aileron was hanging by its actuator cables, torn half away by the proximity detonation that had turned her gun run into a controlled crash. She'd been 3 minutes from home when the Mayday call came through, a civilian voice breaking international protocol with coordinates and the kind of terror that made her bank hard without thinking. Now she was committed. Below her canopy, the wreckage of the Gulfstream G650 was scattered across a valley that maps called uninhabited, but insurgents called home. She could see movement around the fuselage, figures in tactical black moving with purpose, and the flash of small arms fire directed at something still alive in the debris. Her fuel gauge read 20 minutes. Her hydraulics were failing. Her wingman had already peeled off, Winchester and leaking, leaving her alone over terrain where an A-10 moved like a freight train someone forgot to tell about gravity. The radio was alive with voices ordering her to disengage, to return to base, to let the QRF handle it. But Nadia had already seen the heat signature in the wreckage, the shape of someone crawling toward cover while gunfire tore apart the aluminum around them. She'd seen enough men die waiting for permission. The activation of her targeting pod sent a fresh warning light cascading across her panel. Nadia keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the G-forces pulling at her damaged airframe. Kandahar, Hog 27, I'm staying. The silence that followed felt like judgment. Then clearance came through, and with it, the understanding that some decisions were made before the question was ever asked. Nadia rolled inverted, let the Warthog's nose drop toward the valley floor, and committed to the kind of flying that ended careers or created legends. She had no way of knowing it would do both. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was never meant to be beautiful. Built around a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that could fire depleted uranium rounds the size of beer bottles, the aircraft looked like something designed by committee and assembled from spare parts. Its twin turbofan engine sat high on the fuselage, protected from ground fire and debris. Its straight wings stretched wide, built for low-altitude loitering rather than speed. Pilots called it the Warthog with the kind of affection reserved for ugly dogs that saved your life. But watching Nadia bring the damaged aircraft through its attack run, there was something almost graceful about the violence. She came in from the east, using the sun and the mountain ridge to mask her approach. The insurgents had set up a perimeter around the Gulfstream, smart enough to know that rescue would come, but arrogant enough to think they could repel it. They weren't expecting an A-10 with a vendetta and a pilot who'd grown up in the mountains of Colorado, who knew how to read terrain the way other people read sheet music. Nadia's first pass was reconnaissance, the targeting pod recording positions and counting heads while tracers reached up toward her like angry fireflies. 14 hostiles, at least 2 with RPGs, 1 technical with a mounted gun, and in the wreckage, barely visible through the smoke, a figure in a business suit trying to make himself small behind what was left of the Gulfstream's wing. The radio crackled. Hog 27, Paladin 6. We have QRF spinning up ETA 20 minutes. Can you maintain station? The voice belonged to someone who'd never flown close air support, who thought maintaining station meant flying circles while better-equipped assets arrived. Nadia watched an insurgent move toward the wreckage with an AK-47 and intentions that didn't require translation. Negative, Paladin. I'm engaging. She didn't wait for permission this time. The Warthog dropped like a stone, and Nadia felt the damaged aileron protest as she lined up her first gun run. The GAU-8 had 400 rounds remaining. At 65 rounds per second, that gave her 6 seconds of firing time. 6 seconds to change the math on the ground before her hydraulics failed completely or fuel starvation turned the Warthog into a glider. She exhaled, steadied her hands on the stick, and remembered why she'd stayed. The sound of the GAU-8 was something felt in the chest cavity before it was heard with the ears. A deep, tearing buzz that turned the air solid and sent 30mm rounds downrange at speeds that made physics seem personal. Nadia walked her fire across the technical first, watching the vehicle dissolve into component parts and memories. The insurgents scattered, some toward cover and some into the open where the A-10's nose could find them. She pulled up hard, feeling the airframe groan in protest, and banked for another pass while her mind calculated angles and probabilities. On the ground, Marcus Castellanos watched the aircraft overhead with the incomprehension of someone whose understanding of air support came from movies. The plane was damaged, clearly damaged, trailing hydraulic fluid in a mist that caught the sunlight, its right aileron hanging at an angle that suggested malfunction. But it moved through the sky with purpose, each pass bringing it lower, each burst of cannon fire precisely placed to drive the shooters away from his position. He'd seen the pilot's helmet through the canopy on the last pass, the oxygen mask and dark visor that made her look more machine than human. He had no idea she was counting rounds and praying to gods she'd stopped believing in years ago. The second gun run took out 2 RPG teams and scattered the rest into the rocks. The third pass was just noise and fury, the GAU-8 dry firing to make the insurgents keep their heads down while Nadia assessed her options. She had maybe 10 minutes of fuel, no ammunition, and a right wing that was more suggestion than structure. The rescue helicopter was still 15 minutes out. The math was simple and unforgiving. She keyed her radio again, this time broadcasting on guard frequency where everyone could hear. Any station, Hog 27. I'm orbit overhead crash site, Winchester and emergency fuel. If anyone's got creative solutions, now's the time. The response came from a voice she didn't recognize, call sign Sabre 41, an F-16 pilot who'd been monitoring the situation from 30,000 feet. Hog 27, what's your hydraulic status? Nadia glanced at her gauges, at the yellow and red lights that painted a picture of cascading failure. I've got manual reversion on primary flight controls. Secondary is gone. I can fly straight, but turning's negotiable. There was a pause, the kind that preceded suggestions that looked good on paper but felt like suicide in practice. Copy. How do you feel about making noise? And that's when Nadia understood what the F-16 pilot was suggesting. The A-10 might be Winchester, but it still had engines. It still had mass. And in the hands of someone either brave enough or crazy enough, it could become a weapon through presence alone. She looked down at the wreckage, at the businessman huddled in the debris, and made the kind of decision that felt inevitable in retrospect. Sabre 41, I copy. Going loud. The next 6 minutes would be analyzed in after-action reports, debated in ready rooms, and eventually classified in ways that turned tactical necessity into official silence. But in the moment, it was just Nadia and the Warthog, performing an aerial ballet over hostile terrain with an audience that wanted her dead. She brought the A-10 down to 300 feet, low enough that the rotor wash from her engines kicked up dust and debris, low enough that the insurgents could see the damage to her airframe, and know she was flying on determination and nothing else. She flew figure eights over the crash site, Each turn tighter than the laws of physics suggested was wise, using the Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit as both shield and threat. The insurgents shot at her. Of course they did. Small arms fire and one desperate RPG that missed wide because the shooter was thinking about the 30 tons of metal screaming overhead rather than his training. But shooting at an A-10 was like shooting at a glacier. It might notice, but it wasn't going to stop. Nadia felt impacts against the fuselage, heard the ping of rounds hitting redundant systems, and kept flying. Her fuel gauge was redlining. Her hydraulic pressure was gone. The Warthog was flying on trim tabs and attitude, responding to her inputs the way a well-trained horse responds to knee pressure, understanding what was needed before it was asked. Below, Marcus Castellano stopped trying to make sense of what he was seeing and simply watched. The damaged aircraft overhead was performing aerobatics that seemed physically impossible, each maneuver calculated to keep the shooters focused upward rather than on him. The pilot was using her plane as bait, drawing fire that should have killed her but somehow didn't, buying time measured in heartbeats and fuel flow. He'd built companies on calculated risk, on understanding when to double down and when to fold. But this was something different. This was someone deciding that his life was worth more than hers, and proving it with every second she stayed airborne. The rescue helicopter appeared like salvation with rotor blades, a Pave Hawk that came in fast and low, while Nadia's last gun run kept heads down. The PJs were out before the wheels touched dirt, moving with the smooth efficiency of people who practiced this exact scenario until it became muscle memory. Marcus was hauled aboard while the door gunner painted suppressing fire across the ridgeline, and the helicopter was climbing out before the thought of relief could fully form. Nadia watched them go, watched the Pave Hawk disappear toward safety, and then turned her attention to the problem of getting herself home with a plane that had exceeded its structural limits 3 maneuvers ago. The tower cleared her for emergency straighten approach, which would have been helpful if the Warthog was still capable of straight flight. Nadia nursed the aircraft back toward Kandahar, climbing slowly through air that felt thick as molasses, feeling every damaged control surface protest the fundamental concept of flight. She ran through her emergency procedures from memory, cross-checking against gauges that were mostly decorative at this point. The landing gear might extend. The brakes might work. The runway might be long enough. Everything was maybe and might, and Nadia had long ago made peace with uncertainty. She brought the A-10 over the threshold at 160 knots, faster than procedure called for but necessary to keep the damaged wing flying. The landing gear deployed with a thunk that felt like prayer answered, 3 green lights that meant at least something still worked as designed. She touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the concrete with the grace of a freight elevator and the relief of someone who'd bet everything on physics and won. The tower was talking, giving her directions to clear the runway, but Nadia was focused on keeping the Warthog straight, on not letting the damaged aileron turn her landing into a ground loop that would undo everything she just survived. She parked the aircraft on the hardstand, ran through the shutdown procedures with hands that didn't shake until afterward, and sat in the silence that followed for longer than tactical necessity required. Through her canopy, she could see the maintenance crew approaching, see their faces processing the damage to the airframe and arriving at conclusions about the flight that would take weeks to fully document. She popped the canopy, felt the Afghan heat replace the cockpit's stale air, and climbed down to face whatever came next. The debrief lasted 4 hours and covered technical details that would fill 3 separate reports. The flight surgeon cleared her as physically intact, but recommended a psychological evaluation that Nadia agreed to with the understanding that it was theater for the paperwork. The squadron commander shook her hand with the kind of grip that communicated respect without requiring words, and mentioned something about a silver star that Nadia pretended not to hear. But it was the message waiting in her quarters that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Marcus Castellanos wanted to meet the pilot who'd saved his life. The request came through official channels, but felt personal in ways that made Nadia wary of publicity and grateful for something she couldn't quite name. The meeting was arranged for the following evening, after the initial chaos had settled into routine documentation, and the news cycle had moved on to other disasters. Marcus arrived at the base escorted by people in suits who checked credentials and cleared rooms with the efficiency of those who'd done this before. He looked smaller in person than he had in the wreckage, the kind of reduction that trauma performed on certainty. But his handshake was firm, his eyes were clear, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood the math of what had happened. "I've been told," Marcus said, "that what you did shouldn't have been possible, that the damage to your aircraft, the fuel state, the tactical situation, all of it added up to outcomes that didn't include both of us walking away." Nadia nodded, accepting the assessment without elaboration. She'd read the maintenance report on the Warthog. The airframe was being sent stateside for structural analysis, the damage severe enough that it would likely never fly again. "I've also been told," Marcus continued, "that you made a choice, that you had the option to return to base and didn't take it." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavy with implications. Nadia had spent her career avoiding moments like this, where actions were scrutinized for motivation rather than outcome. "It wasn't complicated," she said finally. "You were in the wreckage. They were shooting at you. I had ordnance and fuel. The equation was simple." But Marcus shook his head, the gesture gentle but firm. "No, the equation was impossible. You should have left. That's what the regulations say, what the procedure manual demands. But you stayed anyway, and I need to understand why." And Nadia found herself explaining something she'd never put into words before. About growing up in mountains that looked like Afghanistan. About joining the Air Force because flying felt like freedom until it became responsibility. About the first time she'd performed close air support and watched tiny figures on the ground move because of decisions she made at altitude. About how the A-10 community was small enough that everybody knew everybody, that reputation mattered more than rank, and that there were certain lines you didn't cross no matter what the book said. "I stayed," she told Marcus, "because leaving would have meant living with the knowledge that I had ammunition and you had seconds, and I chose fuel calculations over a life. That's not math I wanted to carry." Marcus absorbed this, his expression shifting through calculations of his own. "The satellite network," he said after a moment, "the one that keeps military drones operational, that connects forward operating bases to command. I built it because I believed in the mission. But I'd never met the people who actually execute at the tactical level, never understood what it costs to make those decisions in real time." He paused, glanced at the photographs on the ready room wall, images of A-10s and pilots who looked simultaneously young and ancient. "I want to do something for you. Not publicity, not recognition if you don't want it, but something that matters." Nadia almost refused. The instinct was automatic, born from a career spent avoiding anything that looked like favoritism or special treatment. But she caught herself, thought about the Warthog sitting broken on the hardstand, about the younger pilots watching her decisions and learning what was possible when regulations met reality. "The A-10 fleet," she said slowly, "is aging. Parts are hard to find, upgrades are expensive, and there's always talk about retirement. If you want to do something that matters, help us keep them flying. Not for me, but for the next pilot who faces the same choice and needs the aircraft to survive the decision." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face from businessman to co-conspirator. "I can work with that." The partnership that followed would reshape close air support procurement in ways that neither of them fully anticipated. Marcus leveraged his connections in Congress and the defense industry to ensure A-10 modernization funding, while Nadia quietly consulted on upgrades that pilots actually needed rather than what looked good in presentations. The work was technical, unglamorous, and executed far from cameras or recognition. But 6 months later, when the first upgraded Warthog returned to the squadron with improved avionics and structural reinforcements, Nadia understood that some victories were measured in capability rather than medals. Her call sign changed after the rescue, the squadron voting unanimously for something that captured both the incident and her approach to flying. They called her Castaway now, a reference to Marcus, but also to her willingness to be stranded by doctrine in service of mission. She wore it without comment, the way she wore most things, understanding that call signs were earned through action and accepted through silence. The younger pilots asked her about the flight sometimes, usually late in the evening when the day's training was done, and the conversation turned philosophical. She told them what she could without making it sound heroic, focusing on the technical decisions and the risk calculations, trying to convey that extraordinary outcomes usually resulted from ordinary people refusing to accept impossible math. The Silver Star arrived in a ceremony she couldn't avoid, presented by a general who understood that some medals were awarded for what you did while others were given for what you refused to stop doing. Nadia accepted it with the grace expected of her rank, shook hands, posed for photographs, and then returned the medal to its case where it stayed except for official functions. The recognition mattered less than the conversation it enabled, the way other pilots started asking questions about tactics and judgment that they'd previously kept private. She became someone they could approach with scenarios that didn't have clean answers, situations where the book said one thing but instinct whispered another. Marcus visited the squadron twice more over the following year, ostensibly to check on the modernization program but really to maintain connection to something that had changed him in ways he was still processing. He'd started a foundation focused on veteran transition support, funding scholarships and job training with the same intensity he'd once devoted to satellite networks. "You gave me something in that valley," he told Nadia during his last visit. "Not just my life, though that's not nothing. You showed me what it looks like when someone decides that another person's survival matters more than their own safety. I'm trying to figure out how to build systems that encourage that kind of decision rather than punish it." They talked about leadership and risk, about the difference between acceptable losses and acceptable choices, about how organizations either enabled moral courage or crushed it beneath metrics and accountability. Nadia found herself articulating thoughts she'd carried wordlessly for years, about the gap between what regulations required and what situations demanded, about how the best pilots she knew were the ones who understood when to follow procedure, and when to write new ones in real time. Marcus listened with the focus of someone recording everything, not for exploitation but for understanding, and when he left, Nadia felt the strange satisfaction of having been truly heard. The Warthog they'd flown that day never returned to service. The structural analysis revealed damage too extensive for economical repair. Metal fatigue that spoke to forces the aircraft was never designed to endure. But instead of being scrapped, it was transferred to the Air Force Academy, installed as a static display with a plaque that detailed the mission in language that reduced 6 minutes of terror to 3 paragraphs of achievement. Nadia saw it once during a recruiting event, stood beside the fuselage that had kept her alive despite every reason to fail, and felt the weight of time transform experience into legacy. The cadets asked her what it felt like to fly in combat, and she told them it felt like being responsible for outcomes you couldn't fully control with tools that might not be sufficient, and then deciding to try anyway. Years accumulated the way they do, missions blending into a continuum of takeoffs and landings, each one successful until the day it wasn't. Nadia made captain, then major, the promotions arriving with the inevitability of someone who'd proven themselves in ways that transcended paperwork. She trained new pilots, passing along lessons learned in moments when decisions couldn't wait for consensus, trying to instill the judgment that separated competent from essential. Some of them got it. Others flew by the book so precisely they never learned when the book was wrong. She worried most about the latter, about pilots so focused on procedure they'd miss the moment when deviation became survival. Marcus's foundation grew into something significant, placing hundreds of veterans in careers that used their military experience rather than requiring them to forget it. He called Nadia occasionally, usually late at night when the distance between their lives felt bridgeable through shared experience. They talked about leadership and consequence, about the burden of making decisions that affected people who trusted you to calculate correctly. "I still think about that day," Marcus admitted during one call. "About you circling overhead with a broken plane and empty guns, buying time with presence alone. It changed how I think about commitment, about what it means to be all in." Nadia didn't have response that felt adequate, so she offered what she could. "You were worth staying for. That's the only calculation that mattered." The conversation drifted to other topics, lighter things, but the weight of that exchange lingered long after the call ended. Nadia sat in her quarters, thinking about the trajectory of a life measured in decisions made at altitude, about how a single choice to stay rather than leave had rippled forward into outcomes she couldn't have predicted. The A-10 community was small, intimate in ways that larger airframes couldn't replicate, and her decision that day had become part of the culture, a story told to new pilots about what was possible when you refused to accept the limits of what was probable. She retired from active duty as a lieutenant colonel, 22 years of service compressed into a ceremony that felt both too long and too brief. The squadron presented her with a piece of the Warthog she'd flown that day, a section of aileron signed by every pilot who'd come through the unit since the mission, a physical representation of influence measured in lives rather than medals. She accepted it with the same quiet grace she'd shown throughout her career, understanding that some legacies were built not through singular moments of heroism, but through the consistent choice to show up and do the work even when the work was impossible. Marcus was there for the retirement, seated in the back row where he could observe without intruding, and afterward they stood together watching the sun set over the flight line where A-10s were taxiing for the evening sortie. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying weight that encompassed years and choices and consequences. "For everything you've built, everything you've taught, every pilot you've trained to make the decision you made." Nadia nodded, watching the Warthogs take to the sky with the ungainly grace that had defined her career. "They'll keep flying," she said, "long after we're both gone, and some of them will face moments where the right choice looks wrong on paper. I just hope they remember there's always a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it." They stood in companionable silence as darkness settled over the base, two people bound by a moment in the mountains where impossible math had resolved to survival, where a damaged aircraft and a determined pilot had rewritten the equation of what was possible. The story would be told and retold, simplified and embellished, until it became mythology. But standing there in the fading light, Nadia knew the truth was simpler and more profound than any story could capture. She'd stayed because leaving was unthinkable. She'd flown because the alternative was standing by while someone died waiting for permission. And in doing so, she'd created something that would outlast them both. Proof that when the moment arrived, when the choice was impossible and the outcome uncertain, there were still people who would choose to stay. The last took off into the darkness, its silhouette briefly visible against the stars before distance made it myth. Nadia watched it go, feeling the satisfaction of knowing her contribution to that legacy, understanding that somewhere in the years to come, another pilot would face another impossible choice, and the story of Castaway and the Billionaire would whisper that staying was always an option. That was enough. That had always been enough.